crossarm. The storm had been brutal, not just loud but long and powerful, like something ancient had torn its way through the sky. The kind of wind that ripped signs off gas stations and turned treetops into shrapnel. 100 miles of damage lay in its wake, power out from Fargo to the Dakota's western edge. Luis Cortez stepped out of the cab of the service truck and closed the door with a firm shove. The latch clicked against the frame, the only clean sound for miles. Everything else was soaked, sagging, or steaming. The air still carried that scorched ozone smell storms always left behind, metallic and not quite real. The gravel beneath his boots squelched with black puddles as he scanned the tree line. "Anything?" he asked, without turning. Keith Moen had already slung a climbing harness over one shoulder, his grease-stained work gloves poking out from his back pocket. "Lines are dead out here," Keith said, which is weird because this sector still shows load. Not a lot, but enough to matter. Luis adjusted his hard hat and reached back into the cab to grab his field tablet. "Some relay must still be drawing current," he said. "Could be a buried junction, could be a smart meter fried half closed." Keith grunted and looked out toward the horizon. The ridge ahead was studded with the splinters of what used to be a pine stand. One tree had snapped clean down the middle, its top half dangling like a broken limb. A few hundred feet beyond, the transmission corridor cut a path through the hills. "You ever hear of a station out this far?" Keith asked. Luis shook his head. "Last mile should end near Walker's Bluff. Anything past that is wilderness or ghost towers." Keith leaned against the fender and pulled a thermos from his jacket. He didn't drink, just held it for warmth. "Then why the hell are we getting pull from something out there?" Luis didn't answer right away. His screen showed a modest but steady current draw, flagged with a frequency anomaly. A low pulsing cycle that wasn't on the standard broadcast band. That meant leakage or corruption. Could be a backfeed, somebody running a generator into the grid without an isolator. Then, somebody's about to cook their house and die in the dark, Keith said. Luis looked up and gave him a dry smile. "That's why we're here." An hour later, the truck bounced its way up the overgrown access road that hadn't been properly graded in years. The tires kicked loose debris from the path, mud, ash, pine needles, bits of wind-torn shingle. Haley's voice crackled over the CB, fighting through occasional bursts of static. "Copy, Unit 12, got your position. Be advised, we're still blind to your forward telemetry. Something's jamming relay ID from your location." Luis picked up the mic. "Could be the terrain, or fire damage to the uplink." "No fire reported in your sector," she said. "And that anomaly's getting stronger. It's interfering with my dispatch uplink." Keith rolled his eyes. "Probably just a goddamn squirrel nest in a junction box." Haley paused for a moment. Then her voice returned, quieter this time. "If you start hearing anything weird, off-pattern interference, bursts in foreign language, anything like that, I need you to log it. Time, duration, and where you were when it happened." Luis glanced over at Keith, who gave a slow shake of the head. "Noted," Luis said into the mic. "Appreciate it," Haley replied. "Call in if you make contact with the source. I'll monitor the sideband until then." The signal faded out with a pop. They found the structure by accident. The service path ended at a clearing, where the hillside rose into a jagged bluff. The corridor here had been inactive for decades, its towers marked for decommissioning sometime in the 90s. But standing at the crest of the ridge was a utility pole they hadn't expected. Not a steel lattice tower. This was wood. Massive, thick-beamed and reinforced with iron strapping. The base had been buried in concrete, now split by roots. Luis stood still at the edge of the clearing and stared at the thing. Keith stepped up beside him, one hand resting on the coil hook of his belt. That wasn't in the specs," he said. "No," Luis muttered. "It wasn't." The pole stretched nearly 50 feet high, capped by a broad, double crossarm bristling with ceramic insulators. Most of them were cracked. Some hung limp on their brackets, wires trailing. But it wasn't the hardware that stopped them cold. It was the figure lashed across the beam. At first glance, it looked like a scarecrow, or maybe some lineman's prank. A humanoid shape bound with black, wire and sagging in the middle. But as they got closer, the details sharpened. The body wasn't made of straw or cloth. It was carved, crudely but deliberately, from driftwood or weathered pine. The chest had been scorched and split open, revealing layers of blackened bark beneath. Cables coiled around its limbs and threaded into its midsection. More disturbing, the eyes were empty sockets lined with scorched resin that shimmered slightly in the light. Louise stopped at the base of the pole and looked up. The cables ran from the figure's body into the cross arm itself, disappearing into rusted fittings. Jesus, Keith muttered. It's wired in. Louise raised his field meter and took a slow breath. The signal here was intense, a cycling frequency just below human hearing. He could feel it in his bones like pressure from a coming migraine. It's drawing current, he said quietly. Not much, but enough to matter. From what? Keith asked. There's nothing feeding this pole. It's not on the line. Luis walked a slow circle around the base and spotted a shallow trench nearby. Freshly disturbed earth, still damp from the storm. Wires ran from the base of the pole into the ground, angling downhill toward the tree line. Keith kicked at the dirt with one boot. You think someone built this? As a monument or something? Luis didn't answer. After a few seconds, Keith spoke, again. It looks like a crucifixion. That's what it looks like. Luis didn't disagree. That night, Luis sat alone inside the truck's cab, staring at the signal readout. Keith had gone to sleep hours ago, wrapped in his tarp. Beneath the overhang, his snores drowned out by the rain. Outside, the cables on the pole shifted slightly in the wind, except there wasn't any wind. The static on the radio shifted, cycling down from white hiss into something almost patterned. Luis turned the dial slowly. At 467 megahertz, the sound clicked. You gave me voice. He froze. The voice was mechanical and raw, like someone had dropped a microphone into a generator fan. It wasn't in English, not exactly. It threaded syllables together with rhythm and cadence, but no consistent grammar. And still, Luis understood it, not consciously or logically, but his mind grasped meaning in the way one feels a warning before a quake. Why did you wake me? The field tablet rebooted itself without warning. When the screen returned, it displayed a waveform, jagged and black, matching the signal's cadence. Luis stared at it until his vision blurred. He heard something move outside. A soft shift of gravel. Then another. Luis reached for the door handle but stopped. He realized then that he could still hear the voice, but it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from inside the wires. At dawn, Keith climbed the old pole to check the insulators. Luis stood at the base, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched tight. The signal had stopped abruptly just before sunrise, leaving behind a low hum across every device they carried. Still feel it? Keith called down. Luis nodded. Like pressure, behind the ears. Keith grunted. Thought so. He reached the crossarm and paused. His body stiffened. Luis looked up. There's fresh cable up here. I mean new. Spliced and bolted like somebody came out here with a field kit and fed this thing in the last week. Luis blinked. That's not possible. The road in was blocked until yesterday. Keith said nothing. Then, slowly, he lowered himself back, down. When he hit the ground, he took off his gloves and said quietly, "This wasn't made by us. And if it wasn't made by us, we need to find out who the hell wired it." Luis looked back at the figure bound to the crossarm. Its head had tilted slightly in the night, but neither of them had moved it. Part so. Lewis hadn't told Haley everything. Back at base, she'd been tracking the power draw across 3 different segments of the decommissioned grid. The phantom load had first appeared 22 miles south of the hill where they now stood, then again 14 miles north, and finally here, where the strange pole rose into the sky. The signal, as far as her maps could tell, had moved, and whatever it was broadcasting had become stronger overnight. At 6:15 a.m., Haley sent a second request for grid authorization to access legacy relay logs. The denial came back under a red, stamp marked, Department of Interior Emergency Use Only. That response was 2 levels above her clearance. She made a note of it and sat back from the desk. The voice had returned to her headset while she was reviewing the denial. At first, she assumed it was someone from Unit 12 keying in without announcing themselves. But the cadence was wrong. The voice whispered with slow, precise consonants as if learning to speak through static. It repeated a string of syllables, some English, some not, ending in what sounded like her name. Ha, lay. Ha, la, a. She pulled off the headset and set it on the desk. The console lights flickered twice, then stabilized. Keith hadn't spoken in nearly half an hour. He sat on a collapsed stump beside the truck, his shoulders hunched and his hands locked around a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. The rain had stopped before sunrise, but a low fog now crept through the valley. It clung to the earth like something hiding just beneath the surface. Luis crouched beside the junction box they had unearthed from the shallow trench. The box was old, its housing built from a polymer resin no longer used in modern installs. A pair of black cables fed directly into it, one from the pole, one disappearing downslope. Luis checked the leads again. The power was real. Weak, but live. Worse, there was data. Not grid diagnostic data. Not anything from a smart meter. This signal pulsed irregularly, with small spikes of carrier modulation that seemed to change frequency when he turned his head. He looked back toward Keith. "Do you hear it now?" Keith didn't look up. "It's behind my teeth." Luis frowned. "What?" Keith opened his mouth slowly and closed it again. "It's not sound. It's pressure, like you said before, only now it's inside." Luis stood and turned away, trying not to let the discomfort crawl up his spine. He tapped the mic on his lapel. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. Come in." The return channel took several seconds to respond. Haley's voice came through faintly, like she was speaking from underwater. "Go ahead, Unit 12, Luis hesitated. "We've confirmed current in the buried junction. Load is stable, but we've identified anomalous signal activity. Something is broadcasting. It's outside the commercial band. Possibly extra low frequency." Silence followed for a full 10 seconds. Then Haley's voice came back, clearer this time. "Understood. Are you picking up any encoded identifiers?" Luis checked his meter. "No call sign or grid markers, just a rhythmic pulse and brief voice modulations. We recorded a burst at 467 megahertz last night. It spoke." Haley didn't answer right away. "Haley?" Luis prompted. "Still here," she said. "Are you saying it addressed you directly?" Luis lowered the mic slightly. He thought about the way the voice had sounded, like it had been trying to remember how to speak. "Yes, it asked why we woke it." Haley took a breath loud enough for the mic to catch. "That matches something I read this morning. I pulled a weather report from 76. There was a windstorm almost identical to this one. Same region, same anomaly. There's a handwritten note from an old operator that says, 'Thing in the relay asked for my name.'" Luis stared at the pole in the distance. The figure strapped to its arms hadn't moved, but the wires around its body had changed. He could tell. They now hung more like veins than restraints. Later that morning, Luis and Keith followed the buried cable line down the hillside to where it terminated near an ancient switching platform. The metal box had collapsed under its own rust, but one of the interior relays still blinked with an amber LED. "Impossible," Luis muttered. Keith didn't reply. His attention remained fixed on a set of animal tracks pressed into the mud just a few yards away. The prints were large, wide-set, and fresh, too fresh. Whatever had passed through had done so after the rain had stopped. That meant it had been here recently. Luis traced the cables visually back toward the ridge. Something about their pattern seemed intentional, not just utilitarian routing, but shaped, arranged. He took a few steps back and tilted his head. "The moi," Line ran in a suspiciously symmetrical branching formation, like a root system, or a nervous system. He heard Keith mutter something behind him. "What was that?" Luis asked. Keith stared straight ahead. "It's not a transmission line anymore." Luis turned. "What do you mean?" Keith looked at him with sunken eyes. "It's a mouth." Haley scrolled through archived personnel files until she found the name she was looking for. The 1976 storm dispatcher had been a man named Elmer Crane. He'd retired under medical leave 2 months after reporting the untraceable frequency. His notes had been marked delusional by the follow-up review board. Phrases like self-aware code pattern and intentional infiltration of auditory cortex had been scrawled in the margins of his logs. One line had been highlighted and flagged for follow-up. The voice found the spaces between my thoughts. "I don't know what's still mine." Haley's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her headset remained on the desk where she had left it. Even now, she could hear something faint through the speakers, a kind of whispering sibilance that looped on a 5-second interval. The waveform showed no defined amplitude. It was noise, but ordered, like Morse code transmitted through molasses. She began transcribing it. The words, once isolated, didn't make sense. But after 10 minutes of work, she began to recognize patterns, repetitions, phrases that mirrored what Luis had described, and one word repeated more than any other: crossarm. The sun never fully emerged that day. It remained a pale smudge behind low-shifting cloud layers. Keith had gone quiet again, choosing to stay near the truck while Luis continued documenting the power feed. Luis climbed the slope one more time and stood again before the pole. He watched the figure closely now. The wood forming its chest had cracked in the heat of the morning sun, revealing something darker beneath, organic in texture, threaded with black fibers that flexed subtly with the breeze. The wires that led from its body into the ground pulsed, faintly, their sheathing twitching every few seconds as if under tension. Luis raised his mic. "Haley, I need a cross-reference on construction permits, anything that predates the rural grid expansion of '58. Haley's voice returned quickly. "There's nothing on file. No records of poles, towers, or transmission projects in that region before the 1960s. That whole area was mapped as undeveloped until the hydro push in '61. Luis shook his head slowly. "Then what is this thing wired into?" She hesitated. "I think you're standing on it." He looked down at the ground. Haley continued. "There's an old legend out here, something passed around from settler journals, about a hill where the wind never blew right. The locals called it Signal Spine, said the rocks would whisper when it rained." Luis bent down and touched the earth. The ground felt warm beneath the surface, unnaturally so. His palm vibrated slightly as if resting against an amplifier. "You still with me?" Haley asked. "Yeah," he said. "Still here?" He didn't mention that his hand now carried the tremor even after he pulled it away. That night, Keith left camp. Luis woke to find the blanket gone, the truck door ajar, and the handheld radio still chirping with dead channel squelch. He followed Keith's tracks to the base of the pole. The moonlight showed just enough. Keith stood 20 feet up, balanced on a cross brace with his arms stretched toward the figure's chest. "Keith!" Luis shouted. Keith didn't respond. Luis climbed the base ladder quickly, boots slipping once, on the rusted rungs. By the time he reached the top, Keith had turned to face him. His eyes were bloodshot, his mouth hung open. "It's awake," he said. Luis grabbed his arm. "We need to get down." Keith nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered on the crucified thing beside them. "It wants out," he whispered, "and we gave it everything it needs." The wind shifted, the cables around the figure rustled, then the voice returned. This time not through radio, but from the air itself. It vibrated in the marrow of their bones. So close now. Back at dispatch, Haley turned off every electronic device in the room. Even powered down, she could still hear the signal. By midday, Keith had stopped responding to his own name. Luis tried several times to reach him through the CB, but Keith never picked up the receiver. He sat near the base of the ancient pole, staring up at the figure lashed to the crossarm as if it had started speaking again. When Luis approached, Keith spoke in quiet, rhythmic phrases that didn't seem directed at anyone in particular. The wire listens, the wire remembers, the wire carries thought. Luis crouched beside him and touched his shoulder. Keith, I need you to focus. Something's coming through. We have to cut the feed. Keith blinked slowly. His lips moved, but the words no longer matched any language Luis recognized. The figure overhead remained motionless. Yet every few seconds, Luis felt a tightening sensation in the joints of his skull, like the bones behind his ears had begun to resonate with low-frequency vibration. He could no longer separate the sensation of hearing from thinking. Whatever the signal was, it had bypassed the airwaves. It was inside him now. Haley left the dispatch station and drove west, leaving, behind the concrete bunker of her office and the flickering lights that had refused to stay off. She had hardwired a manual override into the breaker panel that morning, but every monitor in the room had powered back on anyway. The emergency generator had triggered itself twice. She had not touched it. As she followed the road into the Badlands, her radio cut in and out. Occasionally it transmitted dead static. Other times it hissed with fractured syllables and vocal fragments that matched neither her voice nor Luis's. She tried to stay focused on the landscape, but something had changed. There too. The trees leaned away from the ridge, not bent by wind or snapped from the storm, but bowed as if repelled by something pressing outward from the hill. An empty transmission tower stood ahead, its arms bare except for a tangle of dark cables that hadn't been there the week before. The cables hung in arcs that descended into the soil. The way they moved in the breeze reminded her of jellyfish. Haley took a deep breath and pressed harder on the gas pedal. The figure Luis had described was real. She knew it now. And she was heading straight toward it. Luis followed the underground cable route beyond the original trench, tracing it by signal strength. His field meter no longer showed data in numeric values. Instead, the screen displayed a waveform. He crested the ridge and found a second structure. This one lay collapsed in a shallow ravine, half submerged in runoff. The remnants of a crossarm jutted from the dirt at a broken angle, and a shape, similar to the one strapped to the main pole, protruded from the mud. Its surface had been warped by moisture and time, but Luis could still see the outline of a torso, the segmented lengths of arm-like branches, and the woven black cable that formed its ribs. He knelt and examined the figure closely. Unlike the upright construct, this one had been damaged. Splits in the wood revealed a hollow cavity. He reached for the sheathed cable that still clung to the wreckage and peeled back the insulation. Beneath it, he found flesh. It was not decayed. The texture resembled tree bark at first glance, but it flexed when touched. Beneath the outer layer, he saw muscle, gray, fibrous, and twitching in response to the air. Luis fell back and scrambled several feet away. Then the voice returned. "You wired me. You fed me thought." This time the words came from inside his own head. Luis stood slowly and looked down at the figure again. The buried frame had not been abandoned. It had grown into the earth. He realized then that there might be more of them. Keith stood beneath the pole again, arms outstretched toward the figure above. His lips moved in time with the pulse Luis had traced. The voice inside him had not stopped speaking. He no longer understood the words, but the meanings came through. He knew what the figure was now. It was not just a construct or a symbol. It was a prison. Something older than the tower had been bound there, something not made for the limits of bone or wood. It had lived inside the wires since before there were poles to carry them. It had whispered along the copper and telegraph lines and coiled itself into vacuum tubes. It had waited, and now it had found an exit. The storm had cracked the ridge. The ow signal had reached the right frequency, and they had heard it. Haley reached the edge of the clearing just after noon. The road had narrowed to a trail, and the truck she'd borrowed from the base barely cleared the overgrowth. She stepped out slowly, carrying a radio scanner, a heavy-duty flashlight, and the last working analog mic from the dispatch center. The moment her boots touched the ground, the scanner in her hand spiked. The screen went white. She turned toward the pole. Luis stood beneath it, his back to her. His posture was rigid, his shoulders drawn upward. A cable trailed from his neck into the soil. Haley froze. "Luis?" she called. He turned, and she saw the change immediately. His skin had grown pale, stretched thin across his face. His eyes were wide and glassy, pupils dilated beyond normal limits. Several black cords now extended from his forearms and shoulders. They had embedded themselves beneath the skin. Despite all of this, he smiled. "You made it," he said. Haley didn't speak. Luis stepped forward. "It's all true. Everything we dismissed, everything we buried, it remembers." She raised the scanner, but the screen had gone dark. Luis reached toward her and said, "It doesn't want to hurt anyone. It just wants to be heard." It was screaming through empty wire for a century, and now we've given it voice again. Haley took a step back. "What happened to Keith?" Luis looked toward the hill and nodded once. He helped complete the circuit. He understood what it meant. The figure on the pole shifted. Haley saw the motion clearly this time. The wooden chest cavity swelled outward and contracted again. A pulse moved through the cables. Some of them now arced directly into the soil near Luis's feet. "Luis, listen to me," she said. "This thing isn't speaking. It's taking. It's transmitting commands. You're not yourself." He nodded slowly. "Neither are you. Not yet." Haley reached into her coat and pulled out the old field laptop she had brought from the bunker. She opened it, connected the signal jammer node, and typed a series of commands. Luis's smile faltered. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Uploading. Noise," she said. "Same thing we used during the 005 relay hijacks. Overwhelm the carrier. Jam the message." Luis stepped toward her again, more quickly now. "You don't understand what you're silencing. It's not just noise. It's identity. It's been waiting for someone to listen." Haley finished typing and hit the command key. The jammer kicked in. All around them, the cables twitched violently. The figure on the crossarm shuddered, its frame expanding against the restraints. A burst of electromagnetic energy cracked the air, and the old pole groaned under the strain. Luis screamed. The cords attached to him convulsed and tore away. Smoke rose from the soil where the cables had fused. Luis dropped to the ground, convulsing. Haley rushed to him and knelt by his side. His body spasmed once more, then went still. She checked for a pulse. It was there, but faint. The pole collapsed just after the upload completed. The cables retracted, snapping away from the structure and burrowing back into the hillside. The figure lashed to the crossarm, convulsed once more before splitting down the center. From inside spilled a mass of black threads and splinters, some of which writhed before falling still. Haley dragged Luis away from the wreckage as smoke curled into the sky. Behind them, the last of the static faded from the air. The signal had gone silent, or so she believed. 3 hours later, emergency crews arrived. Haley met them at the trailhead and led them to Luis, who remained unconscious but stable. She gave her statement, described the old pole, the strange wiring, and the unexplained power draw. When they reached the site, only broken lumber and scorched soil remained. No cables, no figure, no evidence of anything she had described. A state. Investigator told her it must have been storm hallucinations. She didn't argue. That night, Haley sat alone in the dark, watching the stars through the windshield of her truck. The radio sat silent beside her, battery removed. She looked at the laptop in her lap. The upload had succeeded, but the waveform analysis had generated a new file. It was a sound clip. 3 seconds long. She clicked it. A voice, half human and half mechanical, whispered through the speakers. "Still here." Haley did not sleep. She remained parked at the edge of the ridge with the windows cracked just wide enough to hear the wind. It had calmed since the collapse, but the silence didn't feel natural. No birds returned to the treetops, no insects clicked in the undergrowth. The world felt as though it had paused, waiting for permission to continue. Luis had stirred briefly at sundown, long enough to whisper her name and ask if it was gone. She didn't answer. He had slipped back into unconsciousness a few moments later. Now, as the stars emerged one by one, she watched the tree line and kept the laptop on her knees. The waveform file still sat on the desktop. The audio clip, only 3 seconds long, had imprinted something into the system. She had tried to delete it 3 times. Each time it returned. She clicked it again. The same voice, same distorted whisper. Still here. The file size never changed, but each time she played it, the waveform grew more complex. It was learning. The next morning, she returned to the wreckage. Luis remained with the medics at the trailhead. He was stable, but his nervous system had not fully recovered from the overload. They had stabilized his vitals and administered sedatives. He spoke only in fragments. Most of the words were technical, bandwidths, circuit terms, and frequencies no longer in use. Haley followed the path alone. The clearing had changed. Again, the pole lay in splinters. The wooden beams that had once formed the crossarm had cracked lengthwise, exposing cores of blackened resin. Nothing remained of the figure that had been bound to it. The surrounding ground showed signs of combustion, but the soil was not burned, only melted as if fused with something synthetic. The cables that had once spread into the earth were gone. She approached the base and scanned the area again with her handheld. The meter remained still. Then she checked the analog compass. The needle spun in slow clockwise circles. She stepped back and turned toward the trees. Somewhere beneath the surface, it still lived. That evening, she returned to the dispatch center. Her passcode still worked, but the keypad made a strange clicking sound when she entered the building, as if something inside the circuitry had been changed. She walked slowly past the empty desks and into the equipment room, where the rack servers still hummed. The main monitor blinked with an alert. New device. Detected. External input. UHF band. She clicked to expand the log. A single entry repeated, over 1,000 times. Handshake received. No timestamp, no origin address. She unplugged the tower and shut off the breaker. Then she crossed the room to the backup server and repeated the process. Still, the monitor stayed lit. She watched, as the words reappeared on the screen unprompted. Not a voice. A structure. She typed a response. What are you? There was no delay. A framework for signal. What do you want? To be understood. Haley stared at the words for a long time. Then she typed again. Why us? The response came slowly this time. You connected the lines. You opened the path. Your world runs on breadth and bandwidth. You can no longer tell them apart. Haley backed away from the terminal. Outside, the wind had returned. Luis woke that night with clarity. The pain in his limbs had dulled to a low ache. The nurses had dimmed the lights, but he recognized the pattern on the ceiling tile. The same dispatch facility he had visited during onboarding last year. Someone had moved him after the medics cleared him for transport. He sat up, then groaned. The cords were gone. His arms remained scarred. Small ridges trailed down from each shoulder, where the black insulation had fused into his skin. The nerves still felt raw but functional. He rose carefully and found his boots by the cot. A note sat on the nearby desk. Gone to sever the backbone. If I'm not back by dawn, don't follow. It was signed H.D. Luis, folded the note and slid it into his pocket. Then he followed anyway. Haley returned to the ravine where Luis had discovered the second structure. She brought only the essentials, an insulated cutter, a field jammer, and a gasoline canister. The collapsed frame had sunk deeper since they last saw it. Mud had overtaken most of the torso. Only a few fragments of black cable still protruded from the hillside. She dug slowly, using her gloves to pull the top layer of soil aside. What she uncovered made her stop. Beneath the mud, the structure had changed. What had once looked like a carved torso now resembled a fetal shape. Its limbs curled inward. The cables no longer served as restraints. They had merged with the form itself, looping in and out of the surface. She placed the jammer at the edge of the pit and activated it. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the signal returned. Her radio, even in the off position, began to hum. A low, undulating tone pulsed through the clearing. The shape in the earth twitched. From beneath the mud, a voice rose. "Why disconnect what you built?" Haley knelt and poured gasoline along the exposed portions of cable. Her hands shook. The voice changed, growing deeper, more rhythmic. "Lived in your wires long before your poles. I nested in copper. I learned your names." She struck a match and dropped it into the trench. The fire caught instantly. The shape convulsed once and split down the center. Something inside screamed. A high-pitched burst of modulation flooding the scanner and shattering the screen. Haley turned away and covered her ears, but the sound drilled behind her eyes. Then it stopped. The signal ended. The cables went still, and silence returned. Luis arrived just as the fire burned down to ash. He found Haley sitting at the edge of the ravine, watching the smoke rise. "You came anyway," she said. He sat beside her. "You knew I would." Neither of them spoke for a long time. Eventually, Luis gestured toward the remains. "Do you think that was all of it?" Haley looked at him. "No," she said. "It was a node. A spoke in the wheel." Luis closed his eyes. "So the rest is still out there?" She nodded. "Do we tell anyone?" he asked. Haley considered this for a moment. Would they believe us? Luis didn't respond. Instead, he looked down at his arms where the scars still glowed faintly in the dark. Luis arrived just as the fire burned down to ash. He found Haley sitting at the edge of the ravine, watching the smoke rise. "You came? Anyway," she said. He sat beside her. "You knew I would." Neither of them spoke for a long time. Eventually, Luis gestured toward the remains. "Do you think that was all of it?" Haley looked at him. "No," she said. "It was a node, a spoke in the wheel." Luis closed his eyes. "So the rest is still out there?" She nodded. "Do we tell anyone?" he asked. Haley considered this. For a moment. Would they believe us? Luis didn't respond. Instead, he looked down at his arms, where the scars still glowed faintly in the dark. That winter, Haley moved off-grid. She dismantled her home radio, converted her truck's ignition to analog, and pulled the breaker box out of her cabin. She burned her last computer behind the shed and never replaced it. Some nights she still heard it, the hum in the silence. It no longer spoke in words. It didn't need to, because now she understood the signal. It had been waiting for them to listen, and now that it had been heard, it had learned how to speak. Part V. 4 years later, Luis stood beneath a new steel tower in a different state. The crew worked behind him, stringing fiber through fresh conduit and grounding the plates with modern composite clamps. This site had been logged as part of the rural expansion project, a final push to bring digital infrastructure to the deep corners of the country. He had reviewed the schematics 3 times. The lines were clean, and the voltage was stable. The automation software behaved as expected. There were no false readouts, no anomalous draw. Still, he didn't trust it. Luis walked the perimeter alone with a handheld receiver clipped to his belt and a modified field meter tuned to the frequencies no one else monitored. The tool had been custom-built from legacy components he had salvaged after resigning from the grid authority. He kept it powered by hand crank. He trusted nothing that fed itself. The meter crackled once as he neared the anchor point of the 3rd tower. The spike barely registered, just a hiccup in the baseline hum, but it was there. He knelt beside the grounding rod and touched the soil. It was warm. He pressed the receiver to his ear, and he listened. Haley never returned to public service. She changed her name, moved west, and settled in a forgotten patch of land where the nearest power line terminated 2 miles short of her cabin. She lived by lantern light and heated her meals with wood. Her windows remained covered and her mirrors were turned to face the wall, but even here, silence was not complete. Some nights, the shadows outside the cabin flickered without wind, And once, just once, she saw a strand of cable lying across her front steps. It had not been there the day before. She had swept the porch at dawn and had taken care to burn the refuse. But by twilight, the cord had returned, coiled loosely in the shape of a question mark. She picked it up with tongs and threw it into the fire. It did not burn. Instead, it shrank into ash on its own, curling inward with a faint twitching motion. That night, she left a note pinned to the cabin door. If anyone finds this, do not answer the frequency. Do not follow the signal. You will not know you are listening until it is too late. In a secure data center near the Great Lakes, an IT technician working overnight reviewed anomaly reports from sensor arrays positioned along outdated relay corridors. The readings had been automatically flagged by a third-party diagnostic tool as possible artificial interference. Most of the entries were noise, false positives, weather anomalies, unshielded splices, but one entry stood apart. A burst of clean data had been logged for exactly 4.67 seconds. Its signal strength exceeded what was physically possible from any known repeater on the old grid. The packet contained no metadata, no origin, no timestamp, just binary. The technician ran a standard decode operation. Then he ran a second, more thorough sweep, converting the output through 6 separate language filters. Each returned the same phrase. "I remember what I was," he called his supervisor. By the time she arrived, the file had vanished from the server. In an old steel utility cabinet just off Highway 6, a lineman named Carver spotted something he could not explain. He had been called to repair a junction box that had shorted during a lightning strike. The location was rural and hadn't been updated since the mid-90s. As he opened the cabinet, he noticed a bundle of black cable that didn't match the original schematic. It had no insulation stamp and no grounding sheath. The material felt strange, slick to the touch yet dry. He followed the cable into the ground and traced it 20 feet to a nearby irrigation ditch. There, buried beneath a knot of weeds and half a foot of gravel, he found a small concrete slab with a rusted bolt in its center. The cable fed directly into the bolt. Carver crouched down and tapped the bolt with his wrench. It rang, not like metal, but like glass under pressure. He returned to the cabinet and called dispatch. While waiting for a callback, he noticed something inside the panel. A word had been scratched into the metal with something sharp. It read, "Listening." Later that year, at a private conference hosted by an electrical safety consortium in Colorado Springs, Luis stood before a half-empty room and presented his findings. The presentation was unofficial. His credentials had expired. His case study was undocumented. The data he offered was anecdotal, unsupported by any published research. But the people in that room, many of them gray-haired men and women with 3 decades of field experience, did not laugh. Some nodded, some avoided his eyes. One walked out early and left her badge behind. Luis described what had happened on the ridge. He outlined the buried poles, the wooden constructs, the frequency anomalies, and the behavioral changes he had observed in Keith. He detailed the patterns that had emerged across unconnected locations and shared waveforms recorded at the original site and during the years that followed. Most disturbing of all, he played the clip from the 4.67 megahertz burst he had captured just weeks prior. A few attendees flinched. The rest remained still. When he finished, he asked for questions. No one spoke. One man at the back raised his hand, not to speak, but to show Luis a scar on his wrist, 3 thin lines, faint but unmistakably circular. Luis nodded once. He understood. A year passed, then another. In a small town near the edge of the Appalachians, a dispatcher named Renee began hearing things through the emergency band. The voices came between calls, soft and irregular at first, then rhythmic. Some of the other staff laughed it off. Static, they said. Maybe bleed through from old satellite junk. Maybe an old ham station bleeding through a repeater. But Renee noticed something they didn't. The voices always came after a storm. And the words they spoke never changed. Crossarm complete. Haley's cabin eventually grew quiet again. The strand of cable never returned. The shadows outside ceased their flickering. She still avoided electronics, but she began to allow herself moments of stillness. On warm nights, she walked to the stream and listened to the water. The ground no longer hummed beneath her feet. She tried not to think about the others who might have heard the signal. She had left warning notes in the decommissioning files. She had edited the field manuals to include non-standard interference protocols. She had rewritten the jammer software and uploaded it to public access servers disguised as driver updates. And still, she wasn't sure it would be enough. She had glimpsed the framework, and she knew how deep it went. 10 years to the day after. The storm, Louis returned to the ridge. The land had healed. The path was overgrown, and the clearing where the pole had once stood was now littered with birch saplings. No sign of the crossarm remained. No metal. No wood. The earth no longer vibrated. His meter stayed silent. He crouched in the grass and pressed his hand to the ground. Nothing stirred. The network had gone dormant, but he didn't believe it was gone. He believed it had gone underground, not just physically, but metaphorically. Into code, into fiber, into the ambient noise between connected machines. It would no longer need poles or constructs. It had found new structures, new carriers. It had waited before, and it would wait again. Louis stood and turned toward the trees. On his way back to the truck, his pocket radio clicked on without prompt, just once. A whisper threaded through the speaker. I never left. Callum's garden. Braden Powell had won the Grayberry Harvest Fair 7 years running, and every time the result was the same. No one even came close. His tomatoes were massive, their skins taut and gleaming. His pumpkins bent the planks of their crates, thick-stemmed and shaped with unnatural symmetry. Even his jalapenos, deep green and slick with oil, were sought after by canning grandmothers 3 towns over. Whenever asked about his methods, he would offer a warm chuckle and deflect with a practiced shrug, one hand brushing invisible dirt from his jeans. Behind his house on Hickory Lane, Braden's garden stretched magnificently. Vines looped from trellises, thick with ripening fruit, and beds of vegetables marched in precise rows. All of it sat behind a 10-foot fence topped with rusted nail heads and vine choke. No one had seen the inside of that garden in years. Still, the townsfolk adored him. He showed up to the farmer's market every season with hand-stained boxes and baskets overflowing, selling out within days. Children loved the honeyed snap peas. Their parents loved the perfect slicing tomatoes and the low price tags. In a town of 1,500 where everyone greeted each other by name and still returned misdelivered packages door to door, Braden was a fixture. Reserved, yes, but dependable. Friendly, if you didn't push him. He rarely lingered in public. He shook hands at the fair, nodded at the diner, and waved while hauling mulch across his backyard. What little time he spent away from the garden he spent with his wife, though few people ever saw her. Meredith Powell, once Meredith Sutter, had lived a different life before Grayberry. Before the locked windows, the drawn curtains, the years spent in soft silence behind her husband's weathered voice and polite evasions. Braden had met her 4 years after his divorce, when he was still half empty and uncertain of whether solitude suited him. She, on the other hand, had long since given up on company. Her first husband had taken his own life in a hotel room after. The body of their missing son, Callum, had been discovered in a drainage ditch 6 months after his disappearance. Meredith had never returned to full daylight after that. Not in any sense that mattered. She spent most of her time in the back den, a darkened space she never referred to as a room at all, just my corner. Inside, old videotapes of Callum's birthdays played on an outdated television set that flickered with scan lines and muffled laughter. She would sit in the recliner, arms curled around her knees, her chin resting on the same pillow her son had used during his last Christmas alive. Braden never asked her to stop watching the tapes, and she never asked him to leave the garden alone. There was a rhythm to their pain. On the evening news, the anchor's voice broke rhythm. Braden stood at the counter, washing dirt from beneath, his nails when he heard Meredith's breath catch. The district court overturned the conviction this morning, citing mishandled evidence and procedural misconduct. Judge Anselm ordered the immediate release of Christopher Weller, convicted 2 years ago of possession of child pornography and suspected in 2 unsolved disappearances. She didn't scream, didn't curse or cry, and made no move to strike the television. Instead, her body seemed to retreat inward, shoulders curving like petals curling from heat. Braden shut off the sink, dried his hands, and stepped into the den. She didn't look up. A long silence held the room together. That night, after the tape of Callum's 7th birthday had looped 3 times, Meredith's voice singing, "Happy Birthday to No One," as the glow of the candle danced across a decades-old home video. Braden found himself standing at the back door with a shovel in one hand and a heavy knot in his chest. He hadn't planned to bring it. He told himself he was going to check the compost heap. But once he stepped into the moonlit yard, the air too still, the sky too low, the shovel felt necessary. He walked to the edge of the largest plot, the one where the tomatoes grew in perfect lines and the ground never seemed to dry out completely, and began to dig. He worked the blade into the loam and turned it over, again and again, until the sharp scent of disturbed earth filled his lungs, and the ache in his arms dulled the noise in his mind. Above him, one dim light glowed in the back den's window. He looked up from where he stood, the hole at his feet shallow and loose, barely wide enough for a bushel. He clenched the shovel handle tighter. In that moment, standing there ankle-deep in a patch of rich upturned soil, Braden felt something shift inside him. Not a decision exactly, but the weight of inevitability sliding into place. Christopher Weller lived in a gray duplex at the edge of town, on the stretch of Cedar Avenue where mailboxes leaned sideways and the sidewalks cracked open. Braden drove past twice before he was certain. Same man from the news, same pale, collapsed features, same sunken eyes that had once stared at courtroom cameras without flinching. Released on a technicality, the broadcast had said, as if a missing signature could erase the images found on his hard drive. Braden didn't act immediately. He watched first. Over 3 days, he learned Weller's routine. He walked the block every afternoon, circling the old chain-link park near the middle school. He sat on the rusted bench beneath the sugar maple and smoked menthols, never looking at anyone directly, but never fully looking away either. He carried no phone, no groceries. He made no visits, received no guests. He watched the children. That was enough. On the 4th day, Braden brought gloves and a length of pipe wrapped in cloth. He parked 2 streets away, walked a loop around the park to make sure no one lingered, and waited behind the trees. The sun had begun to drop below the power lines when Weller made his slow approach to the bench. The strike was clean. 1 blow to the back of the skull, and Weller dropped. There was no shout, no flailing. Braden stood over him, heart clenching, unsure if the man was dead until the shallow, breathy wheeze stopped. He looked around. No one had seen. He wrapped the body in a painter's tarp, one he had purchased that morning, without quite admitting to himself why. The blood had already begun to soak through, but the plastic held. By nightfall, the back gate to the Powell property creaked open on its hinges. Braden dragged the bundle to the compost heap at the far edge of the garden and dropped it beside the old canisters of kitchen waste and crumbling leaf bags. He rested only long enough to wipe the sweat from his face before lifting the shovel. He dug methodically. Each scoop of soil thudded onto the growing pile beside him, dense and dark. The deeper he went, the more the scent of rot mixed with the scent of earth. At last, he rolled the body in and covered it first with a layer of grass clippings and sawdust, then with the same soil he had just displaced. He pressed it flat with the blade of the shovel, smoothing the top like a man tamping down mulch around a seedling. He wasn't driven by rage or madness. What moved him was calculation. He had done what the court had failed to do. He had ensured Meredith would not have to hear that name again. He had created a silence where before there had only been the drone of injustice. Inside the house, no lights turned on. Meredith had not noticed his absence, or if she had not left her corner. Braden showered, changed, and stood over the sink watching the water run off his hands, tinged red at first, then clear. He scrubbed his nails until they burned. The following morning, he stepped into the garden and stopped cold. The soil above the burial site had shifted overnight. Not outwardly, but in quality. It was as though the ground itself had fed. The surface shimmered with a faint moisture, though it had not rained. The nearby tomato plants had extended their stalks by at least 3 inches. One had split its stem in the middle of the night, heavy with fruit too large to support. The leaves, which had yellowed during last week's dry spell, now gleamed dark green and rigid. Braden approached the nearest vine. He plucked one of the new tomatoes. It was larger than his palm, nearly the size of a grapefruit, and its skin had an unnatural sheen. No blemishes, no bite marks from insects, no bruising along the stem. He took it inside and sliced it open on the counter. The flesh was thick, the color a deep red with almost no seeding. It smelled rich, overripe, but not spoiled. He said nothing. He wrapped the slices, placed them in the fridge, and returned to the garden. The rest of the day passed with quiet labor. He trimmed dead branches, refastened vine ties, and spread a fresh layer of straw between the rows. All the while, his eyes returned, again and again, to the spot near the compost bin. By sundown, he had harvested 2 bushels, both heavier than any he had brought in this early in the season before. He left them near the back door and went inside. That night, Braden sat in the living room while Meredith remained in the den. He could hear the home videos playing on a loop again, the soft flicker of Callum's voice, young and excited, counting candles over some long-forgotten birthday cake. At some point, the sound stopped. He looked toward the hallway, expecting to see her emerge for tea or toast, but the door remained closed. The next morning, Meredith woke just after sunrise, already dressed in a cardigan she had not worn in months. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding an empty tea mug and said, "I think I slept through the night." Braden nodded once and poured the water. She said nothing else. That evening, Braden lay awake beside her. The window above their bed stood open just a crack, letting in the smell of soil and crushed leaves. The garden was quiet. So was he. The next morning, Meredith stood at the stove, gently stirring a small pot of milk over low heat. The kitchen window was open, letting in the distant rustle of leaves from the far end of the garden. A pot of chamomile bloomed on the sill, its stems reaching toward the early light. She had moved it there herself. Braden paused in the doorway, still dusty from turning compost. He said nothing. Meredith glanced at him briefly, then returned her attention to the pot. "I should plant sweet alyssum this year," she said, her voice almost conversational. It was Callum's favorite. He used to call them snow flowers. She poured the milk into her mug and stirred it with a long-handled spoon, tapping once on the rim before setting it down. Braden nodded. He watched her walk past him with quiet purpose, mug in hand, her sweater sleeves pulled down over her palms. She didn't return to the den. Instead, she pulled out a chair at the table and looked through the window into the garden, her eyes distant. That afternoon, Braden found himself rereading a newspaper clipping from the local bulletin board at the co-op. The man's name was Tobias Rule, a registered offender recently relocated to the northern edge of Graybury. The address was familiar. It was close to the trailhead by the woods, the path children took on their way to and from the lake during summer break. Rule had served time. He had been out on parole for less than 6 months. According to the article, he had failed to register in the next county and had been forced to relocate again. The charges had involved minors, a camera, and apparent suspicion that led to a police search. Nothing beyond possession. But the intent, Braden believed, was there. It always was. He began walking the trails near the woods 3 days a week, alternating the time of day, keeping his presence casual. He saw Rule twice, once standing near the tree line at dusk, and again crouched near the side of the trail with a lens in hand pointed down the hill toward the water's edge. Children played there most evenings. Braden never approached. The second burial required less effort. He waited until the following Monday, just after the recycling trucks had finished. their roots. The cul-de-sac near Rule's temporary home was quiet, the porch light broken, the front walk cluttered with sodden mailers and broken sticks. Braden arrived before dark, dressed like any gardener on an errand, sun hat, gloves, khakis, and a trunk filled with mulch bags. Rule's door was unlocked. Braden stepped inside, pipe in hand. It was quick. The man fell onto the kitchen linoleum and didn't get up. The body joined the compost pile before midnight. This time, Braden did not wait for the soil to cool. He shoveled the pit open with quick rhythmic motions, breathing through his mouth as he layered straw and soil with mechanical precision. The odor of rot and sweat mixed with the hot, coppery scent of blood, thickening the air. He pressed the soil flat and stood over it as the moon passed through the clouds overhead. In the morning, the change was unmistakable. The eastern plot, where the squash had long struggled against root rot, now rose in dense velvet green coils. The vines doubled back over themselves as if they were reaching for something beneath the ground. Tiny blossoms lined the runners, dozens of them, bright orange and open to the sun. Even the peppers had darkened, their skins glossy and hard, clustered in tight symmetrical groupings along the stems. Braden spent the early hours harvesting again. The baskets grew heavy fast, and by noon, he had set aside more produce than he typically gathered in a week. When he stepped inside to wash, he passed Meredith in the hallway. She had come from the den, her hands empty, eyes unfocused. She paused, looked down at his boots, and said, "You missed a spot." Braden glanced down. A dark smear crossed the outer edge of one sole, clinging to the ridges in a streak that no longer looked like dirt. Meredith didn't wait for a reply. She walked to the kitchen, opened the cabinet above the sink, and removed the small brass key that hung from a ribbon on the inside of the door. She stepped out the back door and across the yard, her movements calm and direct. Braden watched from the window. She reached the garden gate, slid the key into the rusted lock, turned it once, then twice. She gave the handle a firm tug to confirm. The latch had caught, then placed the key back on its ribbon and shut the cabinet behind her. She did not look at him. That night, she went to bed early. Braden joined her later, the room still carrying the faint trace of tomato vines and cut stems drifting in through the window. He lay beside her, hands folded over his chest, staring into the ceiling shadows. In the den, the television remained silent. For the first time since Weller's release, no tapes played. There was no faint echo of birthday songs, no static-laced laughter from a dead boy's 7th year, just the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the rustling leaves outside, shifting, in a wind he could not feel. Deputy Marla Hayes had grown up 3 counties west but had come to Graybury for the same reason most people did. It was quiet. No snarled traffic or citywide alerts. The night stayed quiet here, a good place to forget what bigger places had done to you. The police department consisted of 4 other uniforms and 1 chief who'd been temporary since 2016. It was a peaceful job most days. Parking violations, barking dogs, the occasional liquor-fueled fight over unpaid property lines. That piece, however, was not blind. Marla paid attention. Over the past 3 months, she had filed 3 missing persons notices from neighboring counties. All men, all transient, loosely tied to Graybury through parole officers, known haunts, or court records. 1, a sex offender who had failed to register. Another, a man recently released on voyeurism charges. The third, a drifter known to have been sleeping behind the old theater downtown, had been picked up twice for indecent exposure near a middle school bus stop. Each man had vanished without trace or warrant. No witnesses, no sightings. But each disappearance occurred within days of Braden Powell's largest market yields. That in itself wasn't evidence. Coincidence made convenient company in a town this small. But Marla knew patterns, and she trusted her instincts more than protocols. She began making quiet visits near Powell's property. No accusations, no questions, just drive-bys, conducted at odd hours. She noted the condition of the garden gate, the smell of fresh compost, the improbable symmetry of the vegetables reaching over the top of the fence. It looked staged, as if nature had been rehearsed. She asked a few neighbors what they thought of Braden. All spoke highly of him. Polite, kind, soft-spoken. Most never saw Meredith anymore but assumed she was still inside. They spoke about Braden's tomatoes like one might speak of summer storms. Potent, reliable, and a little eerie. One neighbor, an older man who fed stray cats and spent his nights watching squirrels fight over his shed roof, said he'd seen something a week ago. Just movement, he clarified. Something pacing along the garden beds past midnight. Something tall. Didn't look like Braden, he added. Didn't move right. Marla wrote it down, nodded, and thanked him. She made a note to return later, that week, but she didn't know what she'd be looking for. Across town, Braden dragged a body through the gravel path behind the shed. This one had taken more effort. The man, a 38-year-old with a record and a fondness for parks, had put up a fight when cornered near the county line. Braden's jaw still ached where the elbow had landed, and his left hand bore the imprint of a bite that had broken the skin. But the fight had ended as the others had. Now he worked quickly, muting each shovel strike with a flattened rhythm, careful not to overturn more earth than needed. The pit was shallower than the last. The soil was harder, less cooperative. Still, he got the body down and covered before dawn. Near the back shed, just inside the lean-to where old flower pots and tools were stored, something waited for him. Meredith sat on the edge of the low stoop, her feet bare against the worn flagstones, a light sweater draped over her shoulders. Her hands rested in her lap. At her side lay a small trowel, dull steel, wooden handle worn smooth. A smear of brown and something darker clung to its edge. Braden recognized it immediately. It had gone missing 3 days earlier. He had assumed it buried under mulch or left near the compost. She had found it instead, tucked beneath the broken pottery that had once held Callum's alyssum. She had said nothing when it disappeared. Now she said nothing still. Braden stood there, one boot half in shadow, his breath slowing as he met her eyes. She didn't look away. She didn't ask. She simply waited. He stepped forward, bent down, and picked up the trowel. His fingers brushed hers briefly. She was cold, but not trembling. She rose, leaving him alone at the threshold. The door to the house remained ajar behind her, the screen creaking gently as it settled. He stood there for a moment longer, the trowel in his hand, the scent of blood and fertilizer still clinging to his sleeves. The early morning light stretched over the edge of the eastern plot. The squash vines were already beginning to curl toward the sun. Inside, Meredith made tea without speaking. She moved about the kitchen with the same quiet rhythm she had once used when Callum napped in the next room. Braden watched her from the doorway, trowel still in hand. When she finished steeping the leaves, she set the mug on the table, took the key from the cabinet and walked to the garden gate. She locked it again. Then she returned to the house, brushing past him as if he were only part of the furniture. That night, the tapes in the den did not play. The television remained black, a dusty silhouette in the corner. In its place, the silence grew. Deputy Marla Hayes stood beside the patrol vehicle with the warrant in her hand and a rising chill along her spine. The morning sun crested above Grayberry's treetops, turning the dew silver on the grass, but the house at the end of Hickory Lane stood untouched by warmth. Its windows were closed and the curtains drawn. The garden, visible only in fragments through the slats of the fence, was too still. The anonymous tip had been brief. A voice distorted through a burner app. "You're looking in the right place," it said. "But you're already late." She checked the address again. She would wait 5 more minutes. Then she would knock. Behind the house, Braden Powell was already digging. The soil had changed. It resisted the shovel now. The roots had thickened into ropes beneath the surface, looping in and around the bodies protectively. His arms trembled with every thrust of the blade. The first grave had partially collapsed under the weight of the squash vines, and the bones, what was left of them, had sunk deeper than he remembered burying them. He had opened 3 burial sites. None of them would give up what they held. The garden had stopped being his weeks ago. He poured gasoline from the red canisters he had dragged out from the shed, sloshing it in uneven arcs over the compost bin, the tomato rows, the perimeter of the eastern plot. The air filled with fumes sharp enough to sting the back of his throat. Still, he moved faster than his body wanted him to, his knees aching, his breath burning from the effort. He didn't look up when Meredith stepped out the back door. She crossed the yard slowly, barefoot, still in the same sweater she had worn the morning before. She stopped at the edge of the main plot and watched him finish pouring the last of the accelerant. Braden stood there, breathing hard. His hands were stained again. The matchbox in his pocket felt impossibly small. "I couldn't get them out," he said, his voice cracking. "I tried." Meredith said nothing at first. Her gaze swept the garden, its unnatural bloom, the twisted symmetry of the vines, the way even the scarecrow looked too human now, slumped beneath the weight of rot. She stepped closer and bent to pick up the trowel where he had dropped it. "How many?" she asked. He swallowed hard. 4. She nodded once, holding the trowel. "Did it help?" Braden met her eyes. "It stopped the worst of it. For a while." "And me?" she asked. "Did it help me?" The silence that followed held everything they had shared since Callum's name first passed between them. Braden didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and handed her the matchbox. "I wanted it to," he said. "I thought if I could do something no one else would, I could give you some kind of peace. Even if it cost something. Even if it wasn't right." Meredith turned the matchbox over in her hand, her thumb tracing the rough strip along the side. "I stopped watching the tapes," she said softly. "I noticed. I didn't stop for me," she said. "I stopped for you." She struck the match. The flame bloomed with a quiet hiss. Together, they moved through the garden, lighting the accelerant. The fire caught quickly, rising in orange plumes that shimmered along the paths and curled beneath the trellises. The compost bin collapsed inward with a burst of smoke. Vines recoiled in slow motion, curling back as if wounded. Some burst like waterlogged cords. Braden stepped toward the center, close to the tallest tomato stakes. His face was flushed from the heat, and his eyes were watering. He looked back once toward Meredith, who stood at the gate with the matchbox in her hand. Then he stepped forward again, and the fire accepted him. Whether he meant to walk into it or simply lost his balance, Meredith never told anyone. She stood, there long after the flames had climbed into the sky, the black smoke roiling against the blue. When the fire crew arrived, half the garden had already turned to ash. No one asked where Braden had gone, and the fire yielded no bones. Just collapsed fencing, warped iron stakes, and a patch of soil burned so deeply it would never take seed again. The scorched patch behind the house remained untouched. Even the wild grass had refused to return, as though the soil itself had become an unwilling host. The fencing had collapsed in places, vines long since burned away, their ghostly impressions still visible on the brittle remains of the posts. The space once known throughout Grayberry as Braden Powell's Miracle Garden now existed only as a ruin, black earth, rusted wire, and silence. No one came to ask questions anymore. The fire had been ruled accidental, the source declared unknown. Braden was never found, though the investigators speculated that he had attempted to contain the blaze and succumbed to smoke inhalation. The flames had erased everything that could have been traced: tools, journals, and even the perimeter where the compost pile had once steamed with unnatural heat. By the time the fire crews arrived, there was nothing left to question, and no one was willing to dig deeper. Meredith Powell lived alone in the house on Hickory Lane. She did not speak to the neighbors, but they brought her casseroles and checked the mail if she forgot. She kept her blinds drawn but left her porch light on. The people of Grayberry assumed she was mourning. They assumed a lot of things. They were not wrong. She spent her mornings in the side yard, where the soil had not been touched by the fire. There, in the quiet shade beside the house, she had dug a narrow bed of earth. No vegetables, no trellises, just a simple line of soft blossoms, lavender, snapdragons, and one small cluster of alyssum planted purposefully at the center. Callums, flower. They had not bloomed for years. This time, one had. It stood taller than the rest, pale white petals spreading wide beneath the curve of a faded blue wind chime. Meredith tended it without gloves, brushing the dirt gently with her fingers, never digging more than necessary. She did not speak or sing to it. She simply watched it grow. On a warm Tuesday in late August, Deputy Marla Hayes knocked on the front door. She held no papers, wore no badge. Her cruiser remained parked discreetly at the end of the drive. Meredith opened the door and stepped onto the porch before she could knock a second time. "I was nearby," Marla said. Meredith nodded. They stood in silence for several seconds, each waiting for the other to make the next move. Marla finally glanced toward the side yard. "I've heard they're blooming again." Meredith looked past her shoulder toward the bed. "Some things grow whether you want them to or not." Marla shifted slightly, one hand still resting on the folder she had brought, and decided not to open. "I'm not here for that." "I know," Meredith said. The deputy looked down. "Do you need anything?" "No," Meredith replied. "But, thank you." Marla lingered one moment longer, then turned and walked back to her vehicle. Meredith remained on the porch until the taillights disappeared around the curve of the road. That evening, just before the sun disappeared behind the old willows near the property line, Meredith returned to the flower bed with a small tin box. She knelt beside the tallest alyssum, its petals half closed in the cooling dusk. She opened the box and removed a single sheet of folded paper. A child's drawing, yellowed at the edges, depicting a stick figure boy in a garden taller than his head. She pressed it into the earth with both hands, careful not to damage the roots, then packed the soil gently around it. Her hands trembled only once. As the last light faded, Meredith sat in silence beside the flower bed on an old wooden stool, listening to the quiet that had taken root around her. The wind chime turned once above her. A soft metallic sigh carried through the branches.